Feminist voices accuse the Bible of being anti-woman. Christians complain that there isn't much to read about women in Scripture. This simply isn't so. In this 8-week series, we'll be spotlighting some of the many remarkable women in the Word. We all have our strong points. Maybe your strong point is that you sing well. Maybe you are an outdoorsy person and you're good at rock climbing, or maybe you like to bake. Maybe you're tech savvy, or you're good at debating, or writing, or maybe decorating. I love party planning. That's one of the things that I love to do. My kids' birthday parties, family gatherings, sometimes family holidays. I love that. I love planning and organizing those things. What do you enjoy? In Acts chapter 9, we read of a woman by the name of Tabitha. This woman enjoyed sewing. That was her thing. And in her unique story, we find this simple hobby of hers was used by God in a way that she never would have imagined, I'm sure. So I'm going to read quickly here a few verses in Acts chapter 9, verse 36 through 42. Since this is a short story here, I'm just going to read it real quick. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds which she did. It came to pass in those days that she was sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in the upper chamber. And forasmuch as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. Then Peter arose and went with them, and when he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber. And all the widows stood by him weeping, and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made, while she was with them. But Peter put them all forth, and kneeled down and prayed, and turning him to the body said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand, and lifted her up, and when he had called the saints and the widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And it came to pass that he tarried many days in Joppa with one, Simon, a tanner. That's the story of Tabitha. It's a few verses in Acts chapter 9. And there's a few things that we can learn from Tabitha's short little tidbit of her life here. First of all, Tabitha was a seamstress disciple. Before I get into that, what's a disciple? Just as a reminder, a disciple, it's a personal follower of Jesus Christ. That's what it is. You know, Jesus had already lived in this time here. To give you a timeline, he lived, he died, he's already rose again at this point, ascended into heaven. My Bible says that this story took place in AD 38. So Jesus' death on the cross and the resurrection from the grave, it was fresh on people's minds. It had just happened maybe a year or so prior. So that's where we're at in this story, to give you a timeline. She lived in Joppa. This is a town on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And an interesting fact, maybe you'll remember that name of that city, Joppa. It strikes a chord in your memory. That is also the place where Jonah ran to when he was running from the will of God, when God told him to go to Nineveh. And so I thought that was kind of neat. People called her Dorcas, and to us it's an odd-sounding name, but to her it was just a nickname, and this name actually means gazelle, like the animal, a gazelle. And I don't know why they called her Dorcas. I think it's funny that they called her a nickname that meant gazelle. I'm sure it had a reason for that. Maybe she was lean and graceful. I think of that when I think of a gazelle, or maybe she liked running. I don't know. But that was her nickname, Dorcas. In verse 36, it says, This woman was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. It's noteworthy that in 1 Timothy 2:10, it tells us that women who profess godliness, or profess to be Christians, ought to adorn themselves in good works. This is what this lady was doing. She was full of good works and alms deeds. We learn later in the story that at least a portion of Tabitha's good works were shared in the form of sewing, creating clothing for others to wear. I think that's really neat. It's very unique. But before we get into that, while Tabitha's living her life at this point, at the same time, the Apostle Peter, it says, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, was preaching and healing in the power of God. He was spreading the name of Jesus everywhere he went. And he was at a town nearby where he had just healed a man. So we pick up next with Tabitha's death. In verse 37 and 38, she had been ill, it said, and suddenly passed away. And some disciples sent for Peter. He was nearby. They heard he was nearby, so they sent for him, hoping that God would use him to maybe perform a miracle on this dead woman they loved. And this is where it gets interesting. Peter arrives in an upper room where many women, it says, widows, it actually said, were gathered around her body, Tabitha's body, mourning her, mourning the loss of their friend. And just pause here and interject. Have you ever been to a funeral? Have you ever been to a funeral? Most of us have. Maybe you have not. They're sad occasions. Funerals are a time to say goodbye. But in the process of gathering to do that, many times, you'll go to a funeral and you'll hear stories, or you'll see pictures or personal belongings that bring a remembrance of a person who's passed away. People will talk about ways maybe the person made a difference in their life or some kind of legacy they left behind. And that's kind of what these widows were doing. They were Tabitha's friends, and Peter arrives here, and they begin talking about Tabitha, telling Peter how much she meant to them, showing them the clothing they were wearing, like, look at this, Tabitha made me this. Yeah, she made this for me too. I could kind of just imagine it in my mind's eye. Back in Acts chapter 6, as the disciples of Christ, they were multiplying and ministering, it says that the widows among them were actually neglected a little bit. They would often be neglected. And that was actually when, in that chapter, when the office of the deacon was established. As we know, this is a special group of men who assist the church and take care of the widows and the fatherless. And they were being overlooked. And somewhere along the way, Tabitha developed a burden for them. And making clothes for them became her ministry, her personal ministry. She thought, hey, I have this talent. I can do this. These women are in need. I'm going to help. And so the next thing that I see here in this short story is Tabitha's domino effect. Have you ever played with dominoes? I personally think that they're boring. It's a boring game, but many people enjoy it. And lots of people like them. They even have a TV show about building dominoes or whatever. It's kind of extreme, but they have a TV show about it. When dominoes are set up and lined up on end, it only takes that one tap. One domino to fall to cause that chain reaction. And not one, but many dominoes are affected. And in verses 40 and 41, Peter miraculously raises this woman from the dead, which is something we can't wrap our mind around because it was supernatural and it was by God's power and it was amazing. But it happened. And then the word spread like wildfire. And like a domino effect, this miracle and inadvertently Tabitha's testimony caused many people to believe in Jesus Christ. I'm going to assume that if Tabitha did not live her life as she did and have the strong testimony that she had, this story may have ended differently. We may never have even known of Tabitha. Who knows? So then think with me for a minute. Why do we know her story? What was the difference between her and probably many, if not most, women of that day who knew how to sew? And I'm sure other women around her sewed for other people as well. They probably sewed clothes for their family, maybe their friends. I don't know. What was the difference? Well, I really think and I believe that it was her faith. It was her choice to trust in Jesus, to serve Jesus with her life. That is what made the difference. She was doing something bigger than herself, something outside of Tabitha's comfort zone that ministered God's love to others. I really think that's what made the difference, and that's why we hear of her, and that's why her story's here. It was her testimony. On April 20th, 1999, America was shaken with the news of the tragic Columbine High School shooting massacre. The first victim was a 17-year-old Christian by the name of Rachel Scott, who made it her life goal to do something bigger than herself every day of her life. Whether it was showing kindness towards the outcast or giving advice to a friend, compassion was the legacy she left behind. For a school project, she wrote this, quote, "Compassion is the greatest form of love that humans have to offer. I have this theory that if one person can go out of their way to show compassion, it could start a chain reaction of the same." End quote. We get so wrapped up in our lives sometimes, don't we? We get so wrapped up in our own personal lives. We all have our obligations. We have our routines. We have all of these things. There's sports. There's hobbies. There's family time. There's friend time. There's church time. There's work time. All of these are fine and good. But my question to you today, and I'm including myself in this, is there something more that you can do that is bigger than yourself? Something that is not for your benefit, but maybe for the benefit of others. Is there something that you can do? This woman had a burden for widows, for poor people. She used her hobby and her God-given talent to serve others, to share her faith with others, to share the love of Jesus with others, to give compassion to others. It was so much bigger than herself or her love for this little hobby she had. She wasn't just a lady who found joy in sewing. At her core, she was a disciple who knew she owed her life to Jesus. She saw a need and she made a difference. And we can make that kind of difference too. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this series. It's my prayer that through it, we can all be reminded that women truly are seen, valued, and loved by God.